afternoon, folks. Good evening. I'm talking with Dr. Bruce Epperly, who is in Centerville, Massachusetts. United Church of Christ pastor there. He's been a professor, written a whole bunch of books, but today we're going to talk about three of them in particular, the three he's written in connection with the pandemic. Those are Faith in a Time of Pandemic, Hope Beyond Pandemic, and then Love in a Time of Crisis and Pandemic. So I'll show pictures of the cover here a little later. Good afternoon, Bruce, and welcome.
It's good to be here. Greetings from Cape Cod, where it's 50 degrees and we think it's warm.
Well, hey, it's in the high 60s here. Actually, I think it got into the low 70s here in Florida, so it's nice to talk to people where it's cool. I'm a little bit from northern climes myself.
Well, yes, and it was great on the beach. Even at 50 degrees, the beach is great.
Okay, well, as we've gotten together, let's talk a little bit about these books, just so that everybody can understand. We've had three books. You've written them all during the pandemic, and they all have to do with living faithfully, hopefully living lovingly in a time of pandemic. And so that was some fast writing. And why don't you tell us what got you started? What led you into this writing?
Well, in a way, this has been autobiographical. In addition to being a writer and professor, I'm also a pastor. And it was about the second week in March last year that we began to look at the statistics in our part of the world in Massachusetts and began to get advice from a local physician who's a member of our church and said, well, we probably need to move entirely to social media, to Zoom, for our worship and other programs. And we did, like many other churches, came at it kicking and screaming. We didn't want to do that. We felt it would break down our communities. And of course, when we consulted with folks, they'd say, well, this will just be till a little bit after Easter. Well, I had some sort of inkling at the time that this pandemic could go on for a while. And this pandemic could change our way of life in ways we hadn't imagined. And one day, just shortly, probably the day after we canceled public worship, in-person worship, I was walking on the beach and I said, well, maybe I need to think about this pandemic from the point of view of theology. Maybe I need, as a theologian and as a pastor, to think about ways we can be faithful in a time of pandemic. And I kind of put that out to God in a prayerful fashion. And without claiming that I have the prophetic inspiration of Hosea or Amos, the short book of about 40 pages, 45 pages, came to birth over a long weekend. And the words simply flowed, and that was Faith in a Time of Pandemic, because I felt like people needed to look at this not as an inconvenience. They didn't need to look at this as some sort of punishment from God or something related to God's will, but to see it as a challenge to their faith, a way of living faithfully in a time of pandemic. Well, little did I know, and perhaps I'm a hopeful soul, that 4 months later, we'd be still in pandemic, and we'd still be in lockdown, at least in the Northeast. And I began to ponder, as people began in my congregation and the circles I travel in, began to be impatient. And I began to reflect upon how we can have hope in this time. And of course, we were kind of in the perfect storm in the United States of protest and pandemic at the time. We'd had the death of George Floyd at the hands of a police officer. And there were protests in the street in addition to the pandemic. And the pandemic began to reveal more, in a more lively way, some of the other issues we needed to deal with. And finally, toward the end of the year, I began to ponder the challenge of children. being the active grandparent of two young boys, 8 and 10, who homeschooled with me for 3 months in the spring and then returned to classes in the fall, I began to see the toll that the pandemic was taking on children's lives, and that parents didn't have many resources to talk about faith and values and virtues with children. So that brought about Love in a Time of Crisis and Pandemic. And the books really flowed in part because the pandemic was always on my mind. It was something I lived with from day to day, something I prayed about, talked about, did pastoral care in relationship to, was present in trying to find ways to deal with the unsheltered and the food insecure in the time of pandemic. And then the words flowed in a way that was creative, and perhaps because it was somewhat of a monastic life during that time. I mean, I do have a family, but I wasn't going out the way I usually do, that I had the time to do more writing and more reflection than I might have otherwise. So that's kind of the broad spectrum.
Well, for those who are writers, okay, I need to ditch one of the audios. There we go. Let's ditch that one. It looks like it's working in any case. For those who are writers, then a lot of your motivation, what got you started, is really, in fact, comes from the fact that you're a pastor. It's a pastoral concern.
Yes. Yes. And pastors are really theologians. As a seminary professor, I've always told my students that pastors are the primary theologians of their churches, and that their call is to reflect creatively on God's presence in the times of their lives, and to share that with congregations in a way that edify and call to action. I have the passion of a pastor as well as a writer and theologian, and they all mix together in the writing of these books.
Okay, well, one of the things that writers often ask me is how you go about the process of writing. Now, for you were mentioning to me that you have almost a boilerplate. You know how you proceed with these. What is your writing process once you have that impetus? I need to write about this. It's almost a little bit like you talk about sermon. You have an impetus to do a sermon, and then you need to turn it into an actual sermon that will connect. To talk a little bit about that process.
Right, and in some sense, it's a combination of that old saying of inspiration and perspiration. When somebody asks me how long it took me to write a sermon, I can either answer a few in a sort of chronological way. Well, I sat down and took me 4 hours or so. And at other times I might say, well, it's taken me 40 years to get to this point, or 50 years. I've been a student of religion for about 50 years. So I could say that as well. But what typically happens is that I begin a project with a type of prayer. And the prayer quite often, especially in the occasions when somebody has asked me to write a book about a particular topic, is to say, can I do this job? Am I the person who's supposed to do it? And of course, it's presumptuous at some level to assume you're the only one who could do it. That's obviously not true. But I sort of, as the old saying from the Baptists I grew up with, is take it to the Lord in prayer. I'm out there walking on the beach in the morning, and I'm praying, should I embark on this project? Because I know it's going to take time. And am I the person to do it? So I always begin a project with prayer. And then in a sense, I have the process becomes then a little bit like Frederick Buechner's comment about a person's calling or vocation as the place where your deep gladness or your gifts meet the world's needs. And I say, is there any reason that this book would be helpful to somebody? We obviously, I not looking to sell millions of copies, at least not yet, but I'm saying, is this helpful? And then I do a combination of study and intuition. The thing that's been most helpful to me is I oftentimes, if I'm working on a project, will study a little bit about it and do a little bit of an outline or whatnot. And then before I go to sleep at night, I'll review maybe a sentence or two that I'm thinking about, and I'll take it to bed with me. It's almost like an examen of conscience. I'll take it to bed with me, and then I'll say, almost in a prayerful fashion, to let my unconscious or let God go to work while I'm asleep at night. And then I wake up very early, 4:30 or so in the morning, do my morning prayer, and then start writing. And it almost begins that I almost start writing from the very beginning. So it's a kind of a combination of intuition, immersion, inspiration, and study. And it almost always gives me something by way of a first draft. Of course, I oftentimes, most of the time, do 4 or 5 drafts before it sees the publisher or the editor. But the other aspect that I give to authors, and then my young boys, knowing that I write, occasionally engage me and want to write little books of their own. So we're working on a mystery together. I'll say to them, writing is like painting, house painting. The most important thing for your first draft is to get it on the wall. Don't worry about how good it is. Get it on the wall. Get it on the wall. The author that worries about spelling each word right and getting their grammar right the first time never finishes anything. I figure I have now with computers and the cloud. Thank God for the cloud, because I lose documents sometimes. I have 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 times to go over this stuff before I decide it's fit to share to somebody else. So get it on the wall. Don't worry about how far it's baked. Trust the grace of God. Don't worry about imperfection. I think a fellow who was an editor at Westminster, John Knox, who I'd worked with at one point in time, said, well, the difference between somebody who writes one book and somebody who writes more than one book, and as you know, Henry, I've written quite a few more than one book, is that the person who only writes one book believes they have to say everything in that book. I believe there'll be another chance for me to get it better in the next one. And I believe that every book is finite, incomplete. There's things you could have said that you didn't say, and you just set it out to the universe, trusting that it'll go to the right readers.
Okay, I like that. I got still having an issue with an echo, but there it went away again. Okay, I like the your discussion about going ahead and writing, because one of my favorite sayings, it has been attributed to Voltaire, but it's apparently been traced back to somebody in Italy whose name I forget, was the perfect is the enemy of the good.
Well, isn't that the truth?
But I want to move you here to talk just a little bit before, and I'll put in a little bit about publishing, since we're kind of talking to potential writers, which a lot of people are. What about family? And before I pass it to you, let me turn on. I want to put the love in a time of. Okay, I put up the love in a time of crisis and pandemic picture on so the viewer should be able to see it. That's Bruce with his grandson on a path there on the cover, and so family has an awful lot to do with this. Is that not true?
Well, yes, and again, this volume, as well as another volume I wrote for you, Letters to My Grandchild, both emerged out of relationships with my grandchildren. And in a way, I thought that my own grandchildren who've read the book, at least their father read it to him on a car trip across Massachusetts before it was published, and they seemed to approve of it. Is that, I write out of my context. One of the greatest things that's happened to me is that I don't write in the abstract. A lot of my Energion books have come out of Bible studies or classes or seminars I've taught. And I learned early on that the best way to be a good teacher or a good preacher is to act as if you could publish everything you said. the good stuff at least. And so it raises the bar. With family, it's key. The good news is that I haven't had to hide away from my family in the writing of these books. I don't know, you've published enough books, Henry, and read enough books. Some authors at the beginning of their books say, and I apologize to my wife and children for all the times I spent away. And oftentimes when I read that, I think to myself, was it really worth it, brother? Or was it worth it, sister? And I typically write in the off hours. I write when I was writing a little bit this afternoon, as a matter of fact, and the two boys are off school, and one of them's at soccer practice. The other one, the younger one, is somewhat of an inventor, so he went into the other room and was just going about his business. So I decided to type away. I type early in the morning. Before my wife wakes up. Usually by 9 o'clock, I'm back to the business of being a pastor and a husband and a grandparent, and so I try not to rob from Peter to pay Paul.
Okay, that sounds like probably some fairly good advice to people, and don't rob from Peter to pay Paul. And also the motivation there through the family. And now that we've talked about your family, we've talked about your church. Do you write with a particular audience in mind? Do you have people in front of you as you do that sort of thing?
Well, I do. And what's really helped me, there are two areas that have helped me. In actually some of the first book and the second book, I did some road testing with people. More with the second book. I did a little seminar on the pandemic at church. And so I was actually on Zoom with a group of 10 or 15 people, some of them at our congregation, some from other congregations on Cape Cod, a few from the Midwest. And so they were in conversation with me, and I was learning from them. I have a few friends that I think, and some of them. One of your authors, Patricia Adams Farmer, has written a great book on process theology and beauty for Energion. She's one of my ideal readers. I always send almost everything I write to her. And if she likes it, I know it's a good book, because she's a person who we are very similar in the way we look at the world and our orientation, and she's a high quality writer. So I figure if it passes the Patricia test, it must be pretty good. So she's right now reading a little text I wrote on walks on the beach called Walking with Whitehead, sort of a very lyrical introduction to process theology. And at least I got news from the first chapter she read was, hey, this is pretty good, Bruce. I like this. So, I've always had certain people that were just smart people that were not pretentious, that were smart, who wanted to learn. So, yes, I think that most of my books are some are for scholars, but the intent is for the broad audience of educated lay people, I'd say, that will benefit from that, educated pastors who want to learn things, who want to explore new ideas. So yes, I do have a sort of audience in mind.
Okay, I'm glad that you said that, because if people were to ask me something about how am I going to get my book published, probably one of the key places a manuscript goes offline, and we decide not so much with publishing this one, would be when the author clearly doesn't know who he or she is actually addressing. You get a mixed message. You might want to think about, do you have a coherent message? But I've found that usually if somebody doesn't know who they're talking to, they don't have a coherent message.
Well, that's a big deal, and you know this, and I'll give a plug for several of the books I've written. I'm sure a number of your other authors do the same thing. I think Bob Cornwall does the same as well. The books on Ruth and Esther and Job, let's see, some of the process books were tested with a group. I would, or even in the case of at least the book I'm working on now, they actually read the text along with being in the class, and so I get immediate feedback and immediate questions, and these are lay folk within one or two ministers who come from across the country, and these are people that are not. They're smart people, but not necessarily theologically educated in the formal sense of the word. But I've come to realize how important a reader is, and how important the average reader actually knows more than they think they do. The average reader, who's smart reader, who's not trained in theology, still has all the questions, and they ask you questions. So as you know, Henry, every so often in a book I've written for you, I've quoted somebody in a class. I've quoted somebody's question because that could be the question for that church group that's studying the book, or that person there. And I assume that anyone who takes adult faith formations or Sunday school classes, church school classes, or study groups, I assume they want to learn something. And so there's already a sense of this is the person who might find this interesting.
Yeah, I would add into that when the first book that we published by you was the study guide to Philippians.
Oh, yes.
And
came straight out of a Bible study.
Yes, well, see, I took that and I taught Philippians from that study guide before we actually put it into print. I had actually taught it with one of my classes. And that's, it's an important point, because that's what we're about at Energion. I can comment on that for writers. When you're looking for a publisher, your work, Bruce, is a very good fit for us, because we're interested in exactly who you're talking about, the lay people who want to know more, as opposed to writing a technical text that's for the already scholar.
And yet, at the same time, I will say that a couple of those books have been used in classrooms, academic classrooms, and that's always good news too. Interesting enough, use Philippians as an example. As you mentioned that book, I can think of the 5 or 6 people sitting in the little library, now the art room at our church. This was in the pre-COVID days, about 7 years ago. I can think of one of them's passed, but passed on. But I can think of the 5 or 6 people in this small Bible study that met every Tuesday at noon around the corner. And most of them are members of the church. 1 or 2 were Roman Catholics who came for the Bible study. And I could see them gathered around the table. And what's interesting is that in the course of the COVID year, I've had met with several groups on Zoom from other churches. So I did Faith in a Time of Pandemic, a class one night with a group from Pennsylvania, another group from Colorado. And it was neat to be with people and one from Maine, I recall, to read with people who I never met them before, but they somehow or other had stumbled upon the book, and their pastor or a lay leader said, well, we should read about this.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'd mentioned there, especially because I publish a lot of people, let's say I publish a lot of authors who have doctoral degrees, have been professors in seminaries, and so on, and there's a tendency, which you don't share just out of interest, to not realize where you're pitching your presentation. Sometimes they'll say, I'm pitching this to the lay people, and it's a very high level. What's interesting is several of our books that I know of are used as texts, including your Process Theology, Embracing Adventure with God is used in classes, for example. I get textbook orders from colleges and so on for that. And the interesting thing there is you pitched it to the group you mentioned, these lay people who may not be educated in theology, and that's made it, I think, exceptional for introductory level theology courses that bring that material.
Well, I think so, and I tend, and again, every writer is different, but I tend to write in my speaking voice. I tend to write in and sometimes I even talking as I'm writing along. I'm writing the text and talking as I'm typing to get a feel for that, it comes out of a lecture I just gave where I had a bunch of notes, and then I'm going to put them together. So my main concern is that, and I got this from Madeleine L'Engle, the author Madeleine L'Engle, who's one of my favorites, known both for theology and youthful science fiction type of books and fantasy types of books as well as fiction. She said you have to put the same effort in a book for children as you would for a book for adults and practitioners. And I can tell it. I can tell when I read one of her books how much layers of study she's had behind that aren't obvious except to perhaps another scholar. That when you have an author that knows their stuff, and I always try to know my stuff and before I write it, but then say, how do I help somebody understand this? Because I'm not interested in being smart. I'm interested in communicating. I'm not interested in somebody saying, boy, those are a lot of, fancy words, although I don't mind fancy words. I'm interested in the reader knowing being able to tackle the text with reasonable success.
Okay, that's an excellent goal to have there. And I'm going to pause here. I think we're running down on the half-hour mark, which was my plan. We had the virtual signing with this. If you go to the Energion Direct website, energiondirect.com, you will be able to order Love in a Time of Crisis and Pandemic and have a note for an autograph. If you enter a note for an autograph, we're going to ship it to Bruce, and he'll sign it, and then we'll get it shipped on to you. And so if you want to do that, that's available. Here's one of the guys of which I wrote the book for, coming back from soccer practice. So these are books written for real children, and this is one of my grandchildren here come back from soccer practice. So, this is a real book for real people. I think that Love in a Time of Crisis, a Pandemic, it's a great book for parents and grandparents to talk about virtues in this time and how to be resilient. And so it came out of my talks with my grands and other children at our church. Okay, I'm glad to see that. Now we know it's real. Now we know it. I haven't made up these children. They're not fictitious. Okay, well, with that, I'll let everybody know, and I will put it in. I'll put a link in the comments to make sure that you can find the link if you want to get an autographed copy of the book. And all three books are available. There's also a package where you can save money by ordering all three of them together. So I'll put those links into the comments as soon as we're done with the video. And I appreciate everybody watching. Bruce, thanks for being here, and I'm going to give you the last word, which is what a publisher should do to his author. Well, I just am grateful for the opportunity to have written these three books and published them under your aegis. I'm grateful because I think there's a need, and I think there's enough bad theology out there related to the pandemic. There's enough anti-scientific theology out there. There's enough individualistic theology out there. And this book was one that says you can be a person of spirit, you can be a Christian and take science seriously. You can have church even if no one is in the building. You can have care for science, you can care for your neighbor, you can have hope and hope that there's life beyond this. And this can be a time this is not a lost time. That's one thing I have to say. I'm old enough that I don't want to lose a year. I'm old enough that I don't want to lose a year of my life. And this is found time. This is the time of our lives to do what we can to be faithful to God and our neighbor
And that really was the inspiration of my writing here.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm thankful that you chose Energion to publish these 3 little books. We're pleased to have them. And folks, these are some good books. They're not extremely expensive books, and they're quick reads, but they're very valuable. I found them really easy to mine for quotes that I post on Facebook. You know, I really can hardly say enough good about these 3 books, and I'm glad that Bruce was willing to write them for this time. I said I was going to give him the last word, and there I go talking after him.
Well, the last word is amen, and go forth and be healthy. Get your vaccine, be healthy, practice safe distancing. What do they say? If you love Jesus, wear a mask. Any fool can honk.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, and thank you to all of our viewers.